The Portrait of Death. In a quiet town nestled along the riverbank of New Orleans, there was a gallery known to few and remembered by fewer. The art dealer, an eccentric man named Joseph Marlowe, was the only one who ever spoke of it. He was known for his fine collection of rare, often unsettling paintings, works that were too dark, too strange for most collectors. But there was one painting, an infamous piece, that he kept hidden in a locked room in the back of his gallery. It wasn't just the disturbing nature of the artwork that intrigued people. No, it was the legend attached to it, one that had been whispered among the locals for years. The legend spoke of a curse. Anyone who owned the painting would die in mysterious, often violent ways. The curse was real, they said. The painting was real, and so were the deaths. Joseph had heard the rumors but never put much stock in them. As a man of business, he wasn't one to believe in superstitions. But everything changed when an unassuming collector named Edward Hawthorne walked into his gallery one rainy afternoon. Edward had recently come into a substantial inheritance after the death of his wealthy uncle. The estate had been a curious one, a sprawling mansion filled with antiques, relics, and rare artifacts from around the world. But among the many treasures was a particular painting, one that had never caught his attention until now. It was a haunting portrait, an image of a woman with hollow eyes, her face so pale it was as though she were made of bone. She gazed directly out of the canvas, her expression both sorrowful and malevolent. A thin line of red dripped from her lips, staining the corner of her mouth like blood. The moment Edward saw the painting, he felt an odd pull, a curiosity that he couldn't shake. There was something about the woman's gaze, something unsettling in the way her eyes seemed to follow him, even across the room. He was drawn to it, as though the painting itself had reached out and ensnared his thoughts. He didn't understand why, but he knew deep down that he had to have it. When he approached Joseph with the idea of purchasing the portrait, the gallery owner's demeanor shifted. His eyes flicked nervously to the back room where the painting was stored. A cold sweat seemed to break out across his brow. "I'm afraid it's not for sale," Joseph said, his voice tight. "That piece is different. I don't recommend you go near it." Edward, however, was persistent. He had a way with people, an unshakable determination, and the promise of a large sum of money was enough to make Joseph falter. After much negotiation, and a strangely urgent warning from Joseph, Edward left the gallery with the cursed portrait wrapped carefully under his arm. The first few days after the painting was hung in his grand parlor were uneventful. Edward went about his life, enjoying the luxuries of his newfound wealth. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he dismissed it as an overactive imagination. There was no reason to believe the stories, right? After all, superstition was just that, superstition. But then strange things began to happen. Started with a dream. A nightmare, really. Edward found himself standing in front of the painting, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. The woman's lips parted, and though no words escaped, Edward felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She reached out to him, her bony fingers curling, beckoning him closer. The next morning, Edward woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. He tried to shake off the dream, but it lingered, its weight pressing on him throughout the day. He couldn't look at the painting without feeling a gnawing anxiety crawling beneath his skin. He found himself avoiding the parlor entirely, unable to stand the sight of the woman's lifeless eyes. Then the accident started. At first, they were small, things that could be easily dismissed as coincidence. A broken vase here, a toppled lamp there. But it didn't take long before things began to escalate. One night, while Edward was preparing dinner, he heard a loud crash from the parlor. Rushing into the room, he found that the portrait had fallen from its hook, its frame shattered on the floor. But the most unnerving part? The painting was no longer facing forward. It was turned around, the back of the canvas visible to him. Edward, trembling, reached out to turn the portrait back around. As he did, he swore he felt something brush against his hand, cold and heavy like fingers gripping his wrist. He yanked his hand back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment he knew. Whatever was tied to that painting, whatever evil lived within it, was reaching out to claim him. Things worsened after that. Edward began to hear whispers at night, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls. He'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and the room would be freezing cold despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Every time he looked at the painting, he felt it, a suffocating, oppressive presence that was watching, waiting. It wasn't long before Edward began to see the changes in himself. His reflection in the mirror became distorted, his face growing pale and drawn. He lost his appetite, his sleep, and his sanity. His nights were filled with terrifying dreams, Dreams where the woman in the painting would reach out and pull him into the canvas, her cold hand suffocating him. He would wake up gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. But the worst came a week later. Edward was sitting at his desk when the door to the parlor slammed open on its own. The force of the wind seemed to scream, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman from the painting. Her face was even more grotesque now, her skin twisted and rotting, her eyes black voids staring into his soul. Her lips curled into a sickening smile as she stepped forward, the floor creaking under her weight. Edward couldn't move, couldn't scream. He was paralyzed with fear as she advanced toward him, the very air growing heavier with every step. And then, in the blink of an eye, the room went black. The housekeeper found him 2 days later, lying lifeless on the floor in front of the painting. His skin had gone cold, his eyes wide open, staring at the cursed portrait with an expression of pure terror. There was no sign of struggle, no marks of violence, just a dead man frozen in place. It was said that after his death, anyone who entered the mansion was struck by an overwhelming feeling of dread. The woman's eyes seemed to follow them, and the very air in the house grew thick with an unexplainable sadness. The house was eventually abandoned, left to rot along with the curse it housed. No one ever spoke of the painting again, at least not openly. But the whispers continued, for those who knew better knew the truth. Once the painting was sold, the curse would pass to the next owner. The price of possession. The painting sat silently in the back of the abandoned mansion, its eyes forever fixed on the empty room. No one dared approach it. No one dared speak of it. For years, the house remained empty, its walls falling into decay, its floors warped with time. But rumors never truly fade, and the dark legend of the portrait began to stir once more.
It was in the year 1948 when the painting resurfaced, brought back into the world by an ambitious art dealer named Graham Sinclair, who had recently heard of the mysterious death of Edward Hawthorne. His curiosity got the best of him, and his business instincts couldn't resist the allure of the forgotten masterpiece. He wasn't interested in the curse, nor in the stories of death that followed it. To him, it was just another rare item, another masterpiece waiting to find its place in a wealthy collector's home. Graham traveled to the decaying mansion, ignoring the uneasy feeling that crept up his spine as he stepped through the threshold. The house had been abandoned for so long, its once grand rooms now filled with dust and cobwebs. But there, in the center of the parlor, was the portrait, just as it had been left, its chilling, hollow eyes staring out into nothing. He approached it carefully, not wanting to disturb the heavy silence that seemed to choke the air. He studied the painting, his fingers tracing the frame as he marveled at its intricate detail. The woman's face, pale and lifeless, seemed to shift in the dim light, her blood-stained lips curling into an unsettling smile. It was beautiful, he thought, though it sent a chill straight to his bones. But Graham was a businessman, not a man prone to superstition. The painting was valuable, immensely so, and it would make him a fortune. He had to have it. Ignoring the strange sensation in the pit of his stomach, Graham carefully lifted the painting from its resting place. He felt an unnatural weight in his arms, as though the portrait itself was trying to resist being moved, but he shrugged it off as the strain of age. The gallery owner took the painting back to his studio, where he prepared it for sale. It didn't take long before a wealthy collector named Nathaniel Graves, a man with an appetite for the obscure and the macabre, arrived to view the piece. Nathaniel was well known for his passion for collecting rare artifacts, items with dark histories, things that others would shudder to own. And this portrait, with its twisted past, was exactly what he had been searching for. Graham explained the rumors, the mysterious deaths surrounding the painting, but Nathaniel just laughed it off. He was a man of science, a skeptic who believed that ghosts and curses were nothing more than old wives' tales. The price didn't matter to him. He was driven by the thrill of owning something others feared. With the deal struck, Nathaniel took possession of the painting, unaware that he was now the target of a force far older and more powerful than he could imagine. At first, the painting seemed to be nothing more than a beautiful, but eerie, addition to his collection. Nathaniel proudly hung it in his private study, a place where he could admire it in solitude. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to unfold in the house. It started with whispers, soft, barely audible murmurs that seemed to echo through the hallways at night. Nathaniel dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the old house settling. But as the whispers grew louder, he began to feel as though someone, or something, was always watching him. The sensation grew stronger every time he entered the room with the portrait. It wasn't just the feeling of being observed, but the deep, unsettling certainty that the painting was alive, that it was waiting for something. One evening, after a long day of business meetings, Nathaniel sat in his study, staring at the painting. The woman's eyes seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, and her expression twisted into a mocking smile. It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bloodstains on her lips, redder than before. Fresher. He leaned in closer, trying to discern if it was just a trick of the light, but it was unmistakable. The blood was real. The woman was alive in a way, feeding off him, feeding off the life around her. That night, Nathaniel woke to a sharp knock on his door. His head was heavy, his body aching, as if he hadn't slept at all. He opened the door, but no one was there. He stepped into the hall, calling out to his servants, but the house was empty. There were no answers. It was silent, too silent. As he walked back into his study, he saw the painting had shifted. The woman's face was no longer passive. Her lips were stretched into a sinister grin, and her eyes seemed to be pleading with him. "Leave me be," Nathaniel whispered to himself, but the words caught in his throat as he noticed something else. The air had grown colder, thicker, as if the room itself was suffocating him. The following morning, Nathaniel fell ill. At first, it was just a headache, a faint dizziness that lingered throughout the day. But by the evening, his body had begun to ache terribly. Feverish sweats poured down his face as he stumbled through the halls, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to help him. But his servants were gone, vanished without a trace. When he returned to his study, the painting had changed once again. The woman's eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and the blood on her lips was now dripping down the canvas. Nathaniel's breath came in short, labored gasps as he realized what was happening. The curse was real. The painting was alive, feeding off him, drawing him into its twisted world. As his strength faded, so did his mind. He couldn't think clearly, his thoughts scrambled in the dark corners of his fevered brain. He could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever before, surrounding him, pulling him in. It wasn't long before Nathaniel, too, was found dead in his study, his body cold and lifeless, his eyes wide open, staring at the cursed portrait. The blood from the painting had spread, dripping onto the floor, pooling around his feet. The painting, as it always did, claimed its next victim. The price of possession. The news of Nathaniel Graves' sudden death sent shockwaves through the art world, and once again, the whispers of the cursed painting began to circulate. But this time, it wasn't just the rumors of a curse that spread. It was the fear, the certainty, that anyone who came into possession of the painting would meet a gruesome end. The portrait remained locked away in Nathaniel's mansion for months, no one daring to claim it. But as time passed, the stories began to fade, and the terror it caused started to feel like a distant memory. That is, until a young woman named Clara Wicks, a budding art historian and skeptic, moved to New Orleans. Clara had heard about Nathaniel Graves' death, of course, but she wasn't one to be swayed by superstitions or rumors. She had a keen interest in obscure and macabre art, particularly the paintings that most people ignored or avoided. The legend of the cursed portrait intrigued her, and her curiosity got the best of her. She couldn't resist. One evening, while combing through archives and old newspapers in the city's library, Clara came across the painting's history. Descriptions of the haunting portrait, the sudden deaths, and the mysterious disappearances of the owners sent a chill up her spine. But Clara didn't believe it, at least, not entirely. She thought it was all some grand tale spun over time, distorted by fear and exaggeration. In her mind, there had to be a logical explanation. Clara visited Nathaniel's mansion, which had since been left to deteriorate. Her plan was simple: to examine the portrait herself, to see if the truth behind its curse could be unraveled through research, logic, and analysis. It wasn't hard to gain access. The house had been abandoned for so long, and she managed to find a way into the estate, her heart racing with excitement rather than fear. The front door creaked ominously as she pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The house felt frozen in time, the air thick with the dust of neglect. As she moved through the grand entryway, Clara noticed the faint scent of decay, but she was undeterred. When she reached the study, she found the painting exactly where it had been left. Its frame was cracked and worn, the colors faded, but there it was, unmistakable. The same woman. Her empty eyes staring at Clara from across the room. Clara shivered. It wasn't just the painting's eerie quality that unnerved her. It was the way the room seemed to close in around her, the stillness that hung like a heavy shroud. But she refused to let fear win. She was here for answers. Approaching the portrait, she noticed something that hadn't been described in any of the articles or stories: the woman's eyes. They seemed to follow her as she moved closer, no longer passive, but intent on locking her in place. The bloodstains, too, were darker, almost as if they were freshly applied. Clara reached for the painting. The moment her fingers brushed against the cool frame, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the study door shut. Clara flinched, her heart pounding in her chest, but she pressed on. She would not be deterred. She removed the painting from the wall, her breath catching as she turned it around. The back of the canvas was covered in strange, cryptic symbols, an intricate web of lines and shapes, some of which seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Before she could investigate further, a sharp noise rang out from behind her, something heavy scraping across the floor. Clara spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing in the room. Yet she could feel it, something was there, watching her. Then, the whispers began. The voices, faint at first, gradually grew louder. They filled the room, swirling around her, coming from every corner. They were unintelligible at first, but then, distinctly, they began to call her name. Clara! She froze. The voice was familiar, one she had heard in her childhood, in her dreams. It was her mother's voice. Clara, come closer! The whisper beckoned, and Clara, despite the knot in her stomach, felt an unexplainable urge to step forward. She couldn't resist. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawing her back toward the painting. The closer she got, the more intense the pull became, until she was standing right before it once again. Without thinking, she pressed her hand to the surface of the canvas. The world around her shifted. Suddenly, the room seemed to dissolve into darkness. Clara could no longer feel the solid ground beneath her feet, and a cold, suffocating pressure wrapped around her chest. She gasped for breath, but it was as if the air had disappeared. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, becoming a cacophony of voices. She heard her mother's voice again, distorted, anguished. Clara, it's too late. We've always been here. And then, nothing. Clara awoke with a start. Her body was trembling, slick with sweat. She was lying on the floor, the portrait still hanging on the wall, undisturbed. But something was different. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing. Her vision blurred, and when it cleared, Clara realized she was no longer alone. The woman in the painting, her hollow eyes, now stared directly at Clara, her blood-stained lips parted in a twisted smile. The woman's form seemed to flicker, as if she were caught between the canvas and the real world, her hand reaching out toward Clara with a desperate, eerie hunger. Clara staggered to her feet, her mind racing. The curse was real. The woman in the painting wasn't just a figment of legend. She was alive, alive in a way that twisted the very fabric of reality itself. With panic overtaking her, Clara ran for the door, her breath ragged in her chest. She could feel the woman's presence, chasing her, growing closer, though Clara could no longer see her. The whispers intensified, echoing in her mind, urging her to look back, to see the woman's outstretched hand. But Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. She burst through the door of the mansion, feeling the light of the outside world wash over her, but the feeling of dread didn't dissipate. It clung to her, a heavy weight, like a shadow that would never leave. That night, Clara locked herself in her hotel room, the painting's face haunting her thoughts. She could still hear the whispers, the woman's voice, and most disturbing of all, Clara knew, deep in her soul, that the curse had already claimed her. And just like every other person who had ever owned the painting before her, she was now marked. Clara never returned to New Orleans. Her name was eventually forgotten, but the painting, still cursed, still alive, remained. For as long as it existed, it would claim the souls of those who dared to own it.